Hey, welcome everybody. I'd like to start by giving an acknowledgement that I am presenting today from the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Secwepemc. I live, work, and play on the traditional lands of the Tk'emlúps to Secwepemc within Secwepemc Ulu. So my name is Sonia, and I'm doing some outreach education for GCC. Grasslands Conservation Council of BC aims to foster understanding and appreciation for the ecological, social, economic, and cultural importance of the BC grasslands. We do this by promoting stewardship, conservation, and sustainable management practices to ensure long-term health of the BC grasslands. Just a couple housekeeping points for today. I just wanted people to see that right below me, you have a Q&A box. So that is where you'll put any questions you might have for our panelist today, our presenter, in that Q&A box. You have a chat box right next to it that you can open up. And I want to let you know that if you're going to be sending a message to anyone, it'll default to hosts and panelists in that chat box setting. So you just need to toggle down and make sure you send that message to everybody or to just the hosts and panelists. But once again, if you have any questions about the presentation or questions for Q&A, that gets entered into the Q&A box below. We also have the TNCC's tech support, Ali, who's behind the scenes there. So if you have any questions, any technical issues, please send a message in the chat to Ali. You can put that to the hosts and panelists or to TNCC there. And our webinar today is being recorded, and we'll have a copy of this available online afterwards through GCC's YouTube channel. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our co-host here today, Danielle Topazer, the program manager with the Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative.
Thanks, Sonia. Good afternoon. On behalf of the TNCC, we're really pleased to welcome you all here, and we're pleased to partner with and co-host the Grasslands Winter Webinar Series alongside the GCC. The TNCC operates on the unceded territory, the Secwepemc, Statlian, Silks, and Lacatlam and Silkatine nations. The TNCC supports the work of our conservation partners, including Indigenous communities, governments, academia, stewardship groups, and more through communication, networking, and information sharing and expanding partner capacity. As you know, grasslands are a sensitive ecosystem, not only in the Thompson watershed, but throughout BC, and require special care and attention to protect the limited areas that remain. We're really grateful to Wendy Gardner for joining us today and teaching us more about these unique areas. I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Danielle. And I'm very excited to welcome Wendy Gardner here today. Dr. Gardner is an associate professor within the Natural Resource Science Department at Thompson Rivers University here in Kamloops. She specializes in range management, grasslands reclamation, and revegetation. Wendy has been fundamental support to the Grasslands Conservation Council and their ongoing initiatives. It's great to have you here today, Wendy.
Thanks, Sonia. I'm pleased to be here. So I'm speaking to you from Kamloops, from the traditional unceded lands of the Tk'emlúps to Secwepemc people. And we thought we might start off with a quick poll. I think Ellie's going to put a question up. It should come up on your screen. And we just wanted to get a sense of where everybody in kind of this virtual world was joining us from. So if you can just go through and select a choice, then we'll kind of get to see where everybody's spread out. So while you're working on this, I also want to let you know that last year the GCC also ran a webinar series, and I was asked to do a similar topic, Introduction to Grasslands, and it's titled Grasslands 101, and it is available on YouTube. It was recorded. So I've tried to make this presentation slightly different, although there's some similarities, but I thought I would point out that you could go there to look for more information if you're interested. So if you filled out the poll, I don't know how that's going, Ellie. There we go. Here's our results. Oh, lots of people. So the majority of us from the Thompson Okanagan region, but we have people joining from all over BC and quite a few people from Vancouver Island as well. So welcome, everybody. I guess I can move on to sharing my screen and getting started here. So just get me a second to get set up. Oops. Okay, Is that all good? Everybody can see that?
Looks great.
Okay. So, like I said, I did a similar talk last year, so I've tried to make this a little bit different. And my goal is to kind of look globally and then look at BC and then look at our relationship as people with these grassland ecosystems and why they're so important to us. So I think a good place to start is really, what are grasslands? Because they're so globally distributed, they're actually very diverse, and they are a little bit difficult to define. I mean, fundamentally, it's pretty easy. You say, well, they're areas that are dominated by grass plants, which is true, but they can be a lot more diverse than that. So often we'll have other plants. When I say grass lakes, I'm talking about sedges and rushes. And then we have all the forbs, which are broadleaf plants. Those are all those beautiful wildflowers that we see within our grassland ecosystems. But they can also have a certain amount of woody vegetation. So in Kamloops, for example, we have some of our grasslands are fairly heavily dominated by shrubs. And we can also have woody vegetation, such as trees within our grassland systems. So the important part is that they're still dominated in the understory by grasses or graminoid species. When I talk about grasslands, we're talking about context of native or natural grasslands. So those are systems that have developed, and the plants in those areas are indigenous or native species, and not so much like areas where we've maybe seeded agronomic or tame species for hay, pasture, or grazing. Those would be considered cultivated lands. So if we look at grasslands globally, I'm trying to get my slide to change here. If we look at grasslands globally, we can see that there's probably 2 different biomes that we would consider part of making up grasslands at a global scale. So if you can see my little cursor here, there's this light brown color, that's savanna grassland ecosystems. And then there's this orange color here, which those are those temperate grassland ecosystems. And that's here in BC, we have temperate grasslands. And if you look at this map globally, you can see that grasslands are located on every continent except for Antarctica. So they're very widely distributed globally. If we look a little bit further at these 2 different types of grassland biomes, on the left here, we have our temperate grasslands. So that's found kind of in North America. We would be a temperate grassland system. These temperate grasslands tend to be a little bit drier, so they're considered arid to semi-arid, and they often fall in areas that are classified as having more continental climates. So that means we kind of get more extremes in temperature. So I don't know what the temperature is where you are right now, but where I am, it's -20. So we can get really low temperatures in the winter, and then we can have really high temperatures to like 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. That's an example of continental climate. And the plants have to be adapted and able to survive in those type of climates. And temperate grasslands tend to have fairly low precipitation. And so what's key is that there's a period of moisture deficit at some point during the year, and that's generally during the growing season. Our savanna grasslands are a little bit different. They're considered more tropical grasslands. They fall in areas closer to the equator. They tend to be a little bit wetter, and they tend to have warmer climates that have more consistent temperatures, not those big ranges like in continental climates. They do have a little bit more precipitation, but they still have a wet and dry season. And again, they're still going to have a period where there's a moisture deficit, which is what gives grasses the advantage in those systems. So I don't think we can talk about grasslands without talking about grass plants and how amazing they are and some of the features that they have. So if we think in a global context, the majority of our grasslands are perennial species, perennial grasses. So those are grasses that grow each year, and then the above ground material dies back, and then they regrow the following year. So they come back year after year. We do have some annual grassland systems, but they're pretty small. And these perennial grasses can reproduce both sexually, so through seed production. So if you look over here on the right, this is rough fescue. That's the inflorescence for rough fescue. What's interesting about grasses is their flowers aren't really very showy because they are generally wind pollinated, so they don't have to attract pollinators. And they can also reproduce by asexual reproduction, such as tillering. So if you look up at this plant, this is rough fescue. That plant each year can grow more tillers, and the plant can spread and get bigger and bigger over time. The same is true, this is June grass down here. We also have grasses that can spread tillering by rhizomes. So they have underground root stems that spread out and then they grow new tillers that way. So those are a lot of our kind of mat forming or sod forming grasses that we find within our grassland ecosystems. What's really important about grasses and why they're so well adapted to the systems that they grow in is where their meristematic tissue is. So that's just a complicated way of saying the regions that they grow from. So the growing points of grasses tend to be basal, really close down to the soil surface. And that's important because it protects them from certain factors. And we'll look at that in a minute. Grasses also tend to have fibrous roots. So usually their roots are occupying the top 20 to 50 centimeters of that soil surface. And if you look at this picture here, you can see that, the diagram shows the above ground biomass as being equivalent or maybe even less than the below ground root biomass. And this is true for a lot of our native grasses. They have very large underground root systems, which is really important because those are kind of sloughing off and contributing to the soil organic matter. And they also, if you look across the slide, you'll see that there could be differences in the different plants in these grassland ecosystems so that they have different niches so that they can exploit moisture in different ways. So within grassland ecosystems, there's really three important drivers that kind of maintain these systems. A key one is climate. The majority of our grasslands globally are climate-based, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in this presentation. But they're also disturbance-based ecosystems, and fire and grazing both play really important roles within these grassland systems. So, building on what we were talking about, grass plants, here you can see a grass plant. We said those growing points and those growing regions are located down close to the soil surface. So if we have periods of drought, which is quite common in grasslands, there's regions that those plants can regrow from. If we have fire and it removes above ground material, the regions of growth are still located here and are often not heavily impacted by fire. And the same for grazing. We can remove that above ground material, but growing points are located close to the ground and those plants can regrow. So let's look at each of these drivers in a little bit more detail. In terms of climate, probably the biggest factor is precipitation and temperature combined. So on this graph, we have precipitation showing on the y-axis, and then we have average temperature here at the bottom. And what you can see is, so temperate grasslands, for example, I said they had a wide range of temperatures. So they're going from like -10 all the way up to 20 degrees. But what's common is that they're fairly low in overall precipitation. If we move into our tropical grasslands, they're a little bit warmer, more consistent temperatures, a little bit more moisture, but still moisture is limited. If we drop below the grasslands, this is where we see the desert ecosystems. And if we move above the grasslands where we get a little bit more moisture, that's where we move into forested systems. So grassland systems tend to be systems with a moisture deficit. In terms of fire, if you picture grasslands, they're covered with fine fuels. The plants are fairly continuous. They're generally fairly open areas. They often have windy conditions. And they kind of, in the middle of the fire season, those areas get fairly dry. And so they're quite flammable. So they're very easily ignited by things like lightning strikes. And so naturally, fire disturbance regimes would have been fairly frequent within these grassland ecosystems. But what's unique about fire in these systems is that they're what we call fast fires and often cool fires. So because they're burning that above ground material and there's not a huge amount of fuel loading, that fire moves pretty rapidly and there's not a lot of heat transfer going deep into the soil. And so because the growing points of those plants are down close to the soil, the above ground material can burn off, but those plants can recover really quickly after fire from those regions. And in fact, globally, removal of fire has resulted in loss of grasslands. This is especially true with woody encroachment. So for example, if you're down in the southern United States, Texas, for example, has a huge problem with woody encroachment due to removal of fire from those systems, and now a change into a completely different system. Grasslands have also co-evolved with grazing. So these areas globally would have had kind of wildlife that would have grazed within the prairie system in North America. That would have been the bison. They would be the keystone species that were grazing in those areas. And as we talked about, those plants have those growing points close to the ground, so they can, recover fairly quickly after grazing pressure. Grazers would also have included more than just large animals. I think we always look at the large charismatic megafauna, but a lot of grazers are small mammals and insects. And in some of the tropical grassland systems, insects play a really important role in grazing. So grazing helps to promote heterogeneity, which means patchiness. So if you think animals are out there, they're dropping nutrients in different places, they're selecting for different species. So it helps to kind of make a mosaic that's a little bit different, and you see more diversity out there. We now have more domestic grazers on the landscape, and they might select differently. So it's important that we look at proper grazing management within these grassland ecosystems. So let's move on and look a little bit at kind of BC grasslands and what's kind of happening in this province. So I think most of you probably are aware that within British Columbia, we don't have a large amount of grasslands. They cover less than 1% of the province, but they're a very important ecosystem. I wanted to point you to some resources because I think if you're on this webinar, you're probably interested in grasslands, and there's some really great resources out there. Of course, the Grasslands Conservation Council has a resource page with a lot of different material, but I want to point out this one book. It's called The Grasslands of British Columbia. So Brian and Sandra Wakim published this. It's an 800-page book. It's available as a PDF, free for anybody to download. And if you want to know more specifically about BC grasslands, it has a host of very detailed information, and I highly recommend it. And so some of the material I'm presenting today comes kind of from that document. So in BC, much like globally, our grasslands have evolved under climate, under a grazing regime, and fire, as well as Indigenous stewardship. So in terms of grazing within British Columbia, we didn't have bison. They were not on this side of the Rocky Mountains. And so our larger herbivores probably would have been elk and bighorn sheep. Deer would have done a little bit of grazing, but we also have a lot of small mammals that would graze in these areas as well. We would have had a fairly frequent fire regime within our grassland ecosystems. And I think it's really important to think about Indigenous stewardship. Indigenous people have been on using these grassland areas since time immemorial. And not only, they've also been managing these grassland systems. So they did use fire and cultural burning as a management tool, and that will have also played into some of where our grassland ecosystems are. So for example, a Garry Oak ecosystem on the island is a fire maintained grassland system. So in terms of climate in British Columbia, so here's a map, courtesy of the GCC, showing our grassland regions. So you can see a large section of grasslands coming south of the border in Osoyoos, kind of up into the Caribou-Chilcotin region. We have the Kootenay Trench area, and then we have some northern grasslands. If you look here at this Google map, you can barely see the grasslands in BC. We're really just the northern extent of this larger grassland ecosystem that goes down into Washington and over in Oregon, that's called different things, but I usually go by the term Palouse Prairie. And so we're part of this Palouse Prairie ecosystem. And if you look at these graphs here, this is showing temperature at the top, and you can see that red is hotter, and this bottom one is showing precipitation, where red means drier. So if you look at where kind of our interior grasslands are located, they're hot and dry, and the same for the trench. The northern grasslands, they are limited in precipitation, a little bit cooler, but there are other factors such as aspect, slope, and then edaphic or soil-based features that are important within those grassland ecosystems as well. And BC is hugely diverse, and one of the factors that we've got to look at in terms of where our grasslands are is topography. So topography basically modifies climate. And in British Columbia, we have a fairly mountainous province, and those mountain ranges are really important in how precipitation is distributed. So we call it the orographic effect, or kind of rain shadow. So when, if you're in Vancouver, you've got that Pacific Ocean and these air masses coming off of that, if they move up over the mountains, those clouds can't hold as much moisture. We get more rainfall on the Vancouver side, 70 centimeters here. And then when they move over to like where we are in Kamloops, we're only getting 30 centimeters. So this interior plateau is kind of right in the back of that mountain range. And, so a huge rain shadow effect. If we kind of go further along, we've got the Columbia Mountains, and then that's where we see kind of the Kootenay Trench. As well, I know there's people on from Vancouver Island, and this map doesn't show it, but we do have scattered grasslands on the island as well. Topography also plays a role in terms of elevational gradients. And so as we go up in elevation, we tend to get a little bit more moisture and a little bit cooler temperatures. So the majority of our grasslands are really found in these valley bottom areas. They're those hot and dry environments. And as we move up, we kind of get cooler and eventually more moisture, and then we hit tree line. So in British Columbia, sometimes we talk about our grasslands in terms of elevation, and we talk about lower, middle, and upper. And so I'm going to take you on a little tour. We're talking about grasslands as a teacher. And I think one place where this is really prominent for me anyways, I live in Kamloops and my university's here, but this classroom is right next to it. And we can start here in the lower grasslands and in 15 kilometers, drive all the way up to the tree line and go through 3 different grassland plant communities. And really what it is it's a moisture gradient. So I'm going to take you on a quick little field trip through Lac du Bois to show you some of the changes and what that looks like. So our lower grasslands, those are the ones found in those dry valley bottom areas. And they tend to, in BC, we tend to have a lot of shrub components in our lower grasslands. So in Kamloops, it's mainly big sagebrush. If you move down closer to the border, like Osoyoos, we get into antelope brush systems. The predominant grass species is often blue bunch wheatgrass in these systems. And what's common is that they're fairly dry systems. They have low precipitation, fairly high temperatures, so there's a very clear moisture deficit. And often what we see is these large spaces between plants, because there's only so much moisture to support so much above ground productivity. But we also, within these spaces, we'll have a cryptogamic crust or biological crust, which plays an important role in these systems as well. Now, as we move up a little bit into the middle grasslands, we're going 600 to 900 meters approximately. What you'll see is we have slightly more precipitation, slightly lower temperatures. So that means overall more effective moisture for plant growth. And what we start seeing is more ground cover, like in this picture here at Long Lake pasture. And we see that like the shrub component, big sage, starts to drop out. We see more diversity and overall just more above ground and below ground productivity in these systems. And then if we move up a little bit higher, we move into the upper grassland systems. Here you can see, we're kind of right below the tree line. So we have quite a bit more moisture and even lower temperatures, slightly shorter growing seasons, but we do find overall more ground cover. And in the Thompson-Nicola region, our key plant up there would be rough fescue. If you move further north, it moves more into needle grasses. And so if you look at these side by side, so this was taken on the same day, and I believe it was early June, and I drove up through the lower, middle, and upper grasslands, and you can see within the lower grasslands a huge amount of shrubs, so that's big sage there, and a lot of spacing between plants. As we move in the middle grasslands, those shrubs drop out, those plants get closer together, and there's more overall productivity. And then we move into the upper grasslands on the right, and there's barely any existing open ground cover, way more moisture. You can even see enough to support aspen copse in the background. And if we look at this moisture gradient in relation to what's going on below ground, so remember I said these grass plants have these like above ground material, but these huge root systems below ground, that's reflected in the soil. So most of our grassland soils are Chernozems, not all of them. We have grasslands growing under at least 8 different soil orders. But within Lac du Bois, it's mainly Chernozemic soils. And at the bottom, you see that they're brown, then they go to dark brown, and at the top, they're considered black Chernozems. And really the color is related to the amount of organic matter in that soil. And that's coming from all of that root material that's sloughing off and dying. And so as we have more moisture, we get more productivity, and we see that in the soil as well. And this is important when we start thinking about carbon storage and carbon sequestration. We also have other grassland systems in BC. So if we get higher above the tree line, we can have alpine grasslands, and there's other factors that contribute to why grasses are more successful than trees in some of those areas. And then in systems with a little bit more moisture and with regular disturbance regimes, we can get these savanna grassland systems where you have some overstory, but then you have an understory plant community that is composed of grasses and forbs. And so in Vancouver Island, we have the Garry Oak ecosystem that would fall under the savanna grassland title as well. So let's look at grasslands and people. I think it's important, we're all here to learn more about grasslands, and I think it's important to understand the value that they have to us and the value that we have to them, and what we can do going forward with, conserving and protecting some of these systems. So we used to always talk about grasslands really in a value sense of like what they provided us with, but now we tend to think about ecosystems in terms of the ecosystem services that they deliver to us. So essentially, ecosystem services are just the benefits that we as society receive from these natural ecosystems. And we can break them into 4 different categories. So looking specifically at grasslands, we have these provisioning services. So that's what the values that they're providing us with. So grasslands can provide us with food, fiber, water, medicinal plants. All of those are kind of direct values. But grasslands do a lot more than just provide us with those things. They also have supporting services. So over here, that's things like they're really important in soil formation and protecting those soil areas. Soils take a really long time to develop, and so it's important to keep them intact. They're important in terms of biodiversity, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. And they're hugely important in terms of habitat as well. They also provide cultural services. So inspiration, grasslands are really prominent in terms of recreation use. A lot of people hike and bike and use those areas. They're very beautiful aesthetically. They're very beautiful viewscapes. But they are also very educational. So we're talking about grasslands as a teacher, and one way to really engage people and share knowledge about grasslands is to actually get out within those grassland ecosystems. And then we have regulating services. So these are roles and services that these systems provide to us, like climate regulation, so carbon sequestration and helping to mitigate climate effects. They're really important in terms of pollination. They help to capture and store water. So those all play a role in terms of what they're providing us. So let's look at a few of these in a bit more detail. Biodiversity is a huge one. Grasslands are very species rich, so they have a lot of different species out there. And this is from a recent paper published in 2021, saying that grasslands possibly have higher species diversity even than tropical rainforests, which I think is, a message that we really need to share. Biodiversity is really important because it helps to increase the resistance and resilience of these ecosystems to things like climate change. It's also important in terms of habitat. And so grasslands supply a large amount of habitat. So in British Columbia, for example, I said grasslands make up less than 1% of our province, but more than 30% of our species at risk are found in grassland areas. So that's, they're very important in that sense. Also, when it comes to birds, and I was listening to a documentary and just read a recent report saying that in North America, grassland songbirds are the fastest declining group of birds. And so a lot of these species need native grassland ecosystems, and they need some level of continuity, especially birds that are migratory. They have to move up and down. And so as we lose grasslands or fragment that habitat, it can really impact those species. So they're important for both flora and fauna in terms of diversity and habitat. The other one I think we don't do a good job at sharing is that grasslands are really important in carbon storage. I think the majority of people really think about forested ecosystem and trees as a great way to store a lot of carbon, but grasslands store approximately 33% of our global terrestrial carbon. And what's important about grassland ecosystems is where they store that carbon. So in grasslands, that carbon sink is below ground, and below ground carbon storage is a much more stable sink than when it's above ground. So on the right here, you can see this is Barry Adams, and he's holding a rough fescue plant. And look at the amount of below ground productivity. So for example, if we have a grassland ecosystem and a fire goes through, yes, we lose some of that above ground material and some carbon is released back into the environment, but the majority stays below ground. If we have a forested system and trees burn, then all of that material is released. So with grasslands, as long as we're not cultivating them up, we can maintain that carbon below ground. And research is showing that, good grazing management and other factors where we work hard to maintain healthy grassland ecosystems can really help to increase carbon storage within these systems. So in terms of numbers, it's a little challenging to find numbers because there's so much diversity in how we define grasslands. So I'm just going to focus on temperate grasslands, but globally temperate grasslands cover about 8% of the earth. And more than half of this has already been lost. So it's been mainly, the huge thing is cultivation, so conversion to crops. We have a growing population and we need to feed people, and often these grassland environments are very easy to put into agriculture production. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature published a paper and stated that grasslands are the most altered terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, and they are the most endangered ecosystem on most continents. So I think we often think about tropical rainforests and coral reefs in terms of species diversity and being endangered, but grasslands, especially temperate grasslands, are right at the forefront. And so it's really important that we recognize that. Globally, it's estimated about 4.5% are protected, but there's a lot of variability in what the definition of protected means. If we look at North America, we can see really, if we're looking at the prairie system that kind of goes from Mexico up through North America and into Canada, the tall grass prairie, that would be on the most eastern side of the prairie system. Here you can see all of this orange that shows that it's cropped, or it's been converted to agriculture. So almost all of the tall grass prairie has been converted. The mixed grass prairie is kind of in a little bit further, and the short grass prairie is right kind of in the rain shadow area of the Rocky Mountains. So there's more of the short grass prairie still remaining. If you look down here, this light green shows intact grasslands, and you can see that across here. Those are still heavily fragmented though, due to roads and other variables. Now, if we move right into Canada, we see the same trend, right? The prairie systems have been really highly cultivated, so a lot of loss within that grassland ecosystem. But if you look in BC, where we have this kind of bunch sagebrush, Palouse prairie ecosystem, the good news story is, even though we only have 1%, a lot of what's there is still remaining. So all of this green indicates remaining grassland areas. So we do have an opportunity to continue to keep those native grasslands intact. Currently, only about 6% of the grassland biome in Canada is under any form of protection. So if we tie that all together and come back and look at this idea of ecosystem services and what grasslands are providing to us and how important they are, and then consider that we need these systems, but we have direct impacts on them. So these global threats to grassland, a key one is cultivation and development, especially globally. As population grows, we tend to cultivate more land. Climate change is, definitely a factor. Fire suppression, invasive species, poorly managed recreation and use of these systems. All of these threats can decrease the biodiversity in these systems and alter ecosystem function. So like water cycle, nutrient cycling, carbon storage. And if we decrease these, then it has negative impacts on those grassland ecosystem services. And that feedbacks to, having impacts on us. So what can we do? It's a hard question. I think there's, several things that we need to think about. Key one is to protect and conserve our existing areas. But I think we all have very different definitions of what protection is. For grassland ecosystems especially, that he evolved under a disturbance regime that has both fire and grazing, I think protection has to incorporate that into those systems. So kind of isolating them and removing all of that from them isn't a good way to keep those systems healthy as they move forward. We need to really, work effectively to manage our existing grassland areas and use tools to make sure that if we're, domestic grazing of livestock, that we're doing it in a way that's not harmful or altering that plant community. And we can also keep working to restore grassland ecosystems. This bottom picture here is a group of people out planting in the Lac du Bois area last year. The GCC was involved, and they're putting some perennial bunch grasses back into this area. And so restoration, especially of abandoned cultivated areas and things like that, can be important to kind of maintain or restore some of those previously impacted or degraded grassland systems. So in summary, grasslands most of our grasslands are climate based. So climate plays a huge role in where we find grasslands, and it's all about moisture and moisture deficit at some part in the growing season. But they're also disturbance based and maintained systems, and with the key disturbances being fire and grazing. These grassland systems support numerous ecosystem services, and it's really important that we keep these grasslands healthy and functioning. And I think one way to do that is through education and awareness. So, the theme of this webinar is Grasslands as a Teacher. I think we all should be out there making sure that we're sharing this information with people, and so that they understand the value of these kind of underrepresented ecosystems sometimes, and that we get people out in the grasslands so that they can see the beauty and appreciate the role that they play. So that's kind of all I have for set slides, but I think we have quite a bit of time open so that we would be able to address any questions from people.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was so informative, and I can testify different than your one last year. Thank you so much for adding in those components. I have a couple questions, so if you're okay, I'll read them out loud for you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one from Louisa Richardson. Are Badlands also grasslands? So looking at Alberta, for example, Alberta Dinosaur Park.
Oh, I don't know. I think, I don't know the classification of Badlands. I would have to look at where they are in terms of aridity, but I think they are. I mean, you're getting into where you're getting even into more of a moisture deficit in those areas. So, some of our grassland ecosystems border on kind of more desert ecosystems, but I'm not 100% sure of that one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, we'll be curious together.
I will look it up shortly.
Yeah, that sounds great. I have one from Kim Fulton. Once canary regress is established, is there any way to control it? Not in a chemical manner.
Yeah, actually, this past year, a friend of mine who's also a consultant, Catherine Tarasoff, was doing some work with reed canary grass down in the Kamloops area. And what they were doing is putting these benthic barriers. So essentially what they're trying to do with it was tarp off really large areas and put down this fairly heavy tarping material and keep it so that it isn't able to photosynthesize and kind of starve out all the carbohydrates and kill it off. We've been using that for yellow flag iris and some other invasive species that are in riparian areas where you can't put herbicide, where you're very close to water systems. And so they're trying that as a way. I think the important part is if you're able to get rid of something, you've got to be in there and aggressively get something in its place before it comes back. And often we're seeing sometimes we get rid of one thing we don't want, and then another plant that does really well in a disturbance regime and sometimes is invasive moves in after. So I know that they're the front end of doing that. They just tarped them all recently. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what the results are on that as we move forward.
Awesome. Maybe I can provide some feedback to Kim in the future after that. It'd be great. So we have one from Sarah Peters. How did the planting of native species go? I've heard that they're very difficult to establish.
Hi, Sarah. Yeah, native species, and I just came from a Society for Range Management conference down in Idaho, and I went to a lot of symposiums about restoring native grasslands, and especially they've had some pretty extensive fires down there, and it's really, really challenging. There's quite a few species that we can collect seed from. And, so first you have to get the seed, and then you have to get that seed has to get on the ground, and it has to germinate, establish, and survive. And so we have certain species that we can collect seed, but we have very low germination rates in the field. We don't have a lot of success. So some of those species, we're spending more time growing them out in greenhouse environments and trying to plant plugs, but that's super costly. There's also a demand supply issue. So often, if we have large areas like with fire being a common one right now, and there's a high demand for native seed, there's often not a high supply at the same time. And sometimes when we're getting like native blue bunch wheatgrass, it's not from here, we're getting it from Montana. So it's from a different bioregion. So there's complexities there. Cost of native seed can be an obstacle, but we do have a lot of challenges. And even with sagebrush, they were trying to replant a large amount of sagebrush down in the US because of some really large fires, and sage doesn't resprout from the roots. So it's effectively killed quite easily by fire. And they've been trying plugs and other ways of growing it. And it's challenging. So, I think the idea is there, and we're putting more effort into putting native species out. But especially if we have really large disturbance areas, it gets more challenging. On a small scale, I think we can do it more effectively. And if we can plant plugs, we always have more success than when we try to put seed out. But it is hard. And in arid environments, it's really all about the moisture. So you can do everything right. And if you do not get the moisture the growing season that you plant, then your establishment's going to be really poor.
Yeah, that makes sense about using the plugs there too. We have a lot of great folks adding into the chat, just so people know about some invasive species resources there. So we have another question coming from Nicole. I'm curious about invasive species in our grasslands, such as knapweed. How are we managing impacts on grasslands? What agencies are responsible for this, and what strategies are being used?
The agency thing, maybe Danielle or Ellie can jump in on that one as well. Yes, we have a lot of invasive species within our grassland ecosystems, knapweed being one of them. We have spotted, diffuse, we have a lot of different knapweeds out there. Currently, I think that people are starting to embrace a more integrated pest management and IPM approach, where we recognize we have a bunch of different tools, and you have to look at the situation and use the tools that are most appropriate. So sometimes, we're experimenting. We have students doing stuff with targeted grazing, and that's been actually with knapweed. We can get animals to graze knapweed, but it's really specific to timing it to get on the plant at the time that you can reduce seed production. And there's all these other factors. So it's complicated, but we can use that in conjunction with herbicides and with other tools. So I think, herbicides play a role, and there's a place where we need to use them in certain situations, but I think we can incorporate a lot of other factors, like the whole idea of tarping, mowing, other ways to kind of deal with some of these invasive species, and using a combined approach is really important. I think one thing that's, is our management of these systems in the first place. If we can do our best to reduce the amount of disturbance within these systems, we can reduce the opportunities for these invasives to spread. So if we keep existing areas healthy, then that's kind of critical as well. But I know that's challenging because we have more and more people kind of recreating and using these systems. But I think if we really increase education and awareness on that side, it can really help as well. In terms of agencies, I think, we have the Invasive Species Council of BC, and then regionally we have our different invasive species groups that all play a role. I don't know if Ellie or Danielle might be able to speak to that further. I don't do a lot, I come from more of an academic background, so operationally on a land base, I know that there's different parties involved depending on if it's public or private land.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Wendy, I think you nailed it. The Invasive Species Council of BC does an awful lot of work in education and outreach. And then there's also, of course, some regional invasive species committees that can help more locally as well in the TNRD. They have an excellent program as well.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for stepping in.
And one thing I didn't, and I talked about targeted grazing, but the other biological control obviously is we have biocontrol like insects for quite a few of our species out there that we're able to release knapweed. We have a fairly large biocontrol program. So that can be part of that IPM process, incorporating that in as well.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. I have a question from Lori. I'm interested in ways to control invasive thistles that don't harm native bees.
I have not worked a lot with invasive thistles. So I'm probably not the best resource for that. But yeah, I mean, I know they've done targeted, like on certain thistles, they have been able to do a certain amount of targeted grazing. It wouldn't harm the bees, but it removes, I mean, you're still, if you're looking at the thistles as a base for pollinators, you're removing that. But if I'm assuming that there's a whole host of other species out there that the bees could use. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I have enough expertise to answer that question well.
Thanks, Wendy. We'll move on to a couple more questions before we wrap up. Louisa would like to know if we can use your information provided for other education, like some of your charts.
Please, yes. And if you want anything, you can email me. I don't know if my email was provided, but I have a TRU email. It's just wgardner@tru.ca, and I can provide you with resources. There's actually a really excellent paper that I found about grasslands globally. It's written in kind of more of a North American context, but it's available online, so free of charge. And it was published in 2014, and it's out of a book, and it's a full chapter on grassland ecology. And it has a really good perspective about grasslands globally. And so I highly recommend that as well. So if anybody wants any of those resources, there's quite a few recent publications in the last year or two about grasslands that have a global, but also a BC context too, that I tried to put the sources in the slide so you could see the citations, but if anybody wants access to those, just email me and I would be happy to share any of it.
Thank you for your generosity, Wendy. We added your email address in the chat there for folks. And let's see, we've got another question. What level of awareness do you think the provincial government has of the need to ramp up grassland awareness or preservation?
Oh, I would say probably on the provincial radar. Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it's still low. I mean, grasslands make up a low percent of our land base. In terms of economic potential, I mean, BC is still a forest-driven province. Forestry, gains more recognition. Also, a lot of the things that come up on the political agenda are really driven by public pressure. I do not think there is as much public pressure on conserving grasslands as there is old growth forests. So, all of those factors. I do think that there is more awareness. Like, I've been at TRU for over 20 years now, and I do see a shift, especially in my students coming in terms of their awareness about grasslands. And, at the beginning, I teach a course on grassland ecology. We talk about what they know, and they already know quite a bit. Whereas, 10, 15 years ago, a lot of my students were like, why do we even have to take this course? I'm not interested in grasslands. I don't know the value of why I need to learn about them. So I think there's been a shift that way. I don't know if that is a good barometer for what the shift has been like up at higher levels of provincial government. I feel like groups like the Grassland Conservation Council and other groups help to inform and raise awareness. But I still think that, things like development of areas, grasslands are often get targeted. There's reforestation efforts that sometimes, look at grasslands as areas to plant trees, and you're like, no, that's not a good idea. They're storing carbon. They're doing a good job on their own. Don't try and put trees there. So, yeah, I don't know if you would know more about that, Ellie, or someone, Danielle.
Sorry, Wendy, can you repeat that question?
It was about the, how informed do you think our provincial government is about grassland challenges?
Oh, I think the provincial government is very well informed. I think indeed it is a big challenge though, and strategizing with partners and collaborating with multiple different and across multiple different agencies and jurisdictions is definitely on the radar, and has been something that's been worked on for a long time and continues to be a big effort, and also ongoing effort. Sure. Does anyone from the province, perhaps? I know Heather Richardson's been quite involved and engaged in grassland management, so I don't have much more to add to that.
I don't have much more to add to that at the moment here myself, but I do think that it really loops into the level of engagement, like you're saying, Wendy, with your students coming in and having some awareness there. I think that will trickle, like that trickles up, like naturally that trickles up. That also answers a question here we had from Kathy Hallpatch, who was curious about if over the years of teaching at university, you are seeing more students taking your courses on grasslands. So I think that answers that there too.
I have 55 students in my grassland ecology class this term. So, and the other year during the pandemic, the online year, I had 60 students, which was a really large class. So yes, seeing more students, and then definitely students within the natural resource science program. They are required to take it, but then we have students from other programs that are just interested and come and take it as well. And then also Sonia, well, I'm involved with Sonia and with the Grasslands Conservation Council, and I have funding from the Stober Foundation, and we're helping to build and develop curriculum on grasslands for elementary school and then hopefully high school students. So we're working on that right now with the focus of building this curriculum. There's already existing pieces out there, but putting it into a kind of a more structured setup that will be accessible to teachers so that they can put it in their classrooms and start talking about these systems in grade 3, 4, and 5, and then again at the high school level, and using kind of our own ecosystems in our backyard as examples of areas that are really important to conserve and protect. So I'm hoping that once that gets off the ground, then we'll start seeing, I think it's always critical to get the young people. Like when you get children in elementary school, you have a huge ability to inform them, and then they will build that into kind of what their values and opinions are. When I get them at university, yes, you can educate them and create more awareness, but they often already have a very kind of more set mind frame. So I feel like trying to get this idea of grasslands into curriculum at younger levels is really important as well.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. We also have Mike Deedles from the GCC here joining us that might be able to offer a little bit more insight into this awareness that the provincial government might have of grassland prevention or preservation, sorry.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'd just like to thank everybody who's joined in. I'm really enjoying working with the Grasslands Council, and it's great to have the Thompson Nicola Conservation Collaborative here as a partner to help put this on. And I do help Sonia for getting it together and Wendy for speaking. So, and to all who joined through the conservation partnerships, we've got a great uptake on LinkedIn, et cetera, to get the word spread around. So we had a good crowd out today, I'm sure. As far as government awareness goes, Catherine posted a little note here from the new Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, and we're working closely to try to work with them on potential projects in the future. So the future for Grasslands Council is looking bright, and thank you all for your involvement and look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Don't hesitate to contact me at the GCC website, www.bcgrasslands.org, if you get any questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, so Wendy, we'll probably have 2 more questions here and then we'll wrap up. So we have a question, where are the grasslands located on Vancouver Island? I'd like to visit them.
Oh, well, the Gary, you know what? I have to get down there. It's been so long. So the Gary Oak ecosystem is fairly kind of close to the Victoria area. So I know I know that there's a bunch of students from the University of Victoria doing work on grassland restoration in that area. So you might be able to reach out to someone there if you want to go over and look at them. And there's also, like, even within the Gulf Islands, there's these little areas that we call grassy balds, which are also part of what we would consider native grassland ecosystems. And those are scattered throughout kind of the Gulf Island region.
Yeah, there are definitely down on the islands and Victoria. And our last question, how important was cultural First Nations burning, and what was the average frequency, if you're able to mention that or speak to that?
I think cultural burning is really important. We talk about these natural fire regimes, and then we kind of, what do we mean, natural? And people are saying, well, lightning strikes, but I don't think you can decouple, cultural burning from that, because cultural burning was happening within our grassland systems for thousands and thousands of years. Indigenous people were using fire as a tool to manage those systems, to change plant community, to draw animals in for hunting, to, for all kinds of different purposes. So I think that played a really an important role in our more climate-based fire, open, really dry systems. We would have really frequent fire just from lightning. But if you look at things like the Garry Oak ecosystem, that would really be anthropogenic. That was really Indigenous cultural burning that would really help maintain those systems. It's hard to come up with an interval because it's so diverse depending on where you are and what grassland ecosystem. There's a lot of debate about that. But I would say, for the literature that I've seen for kind of the grasslands in the southern interior, it was, 5 to 20 year frequency. It could be fairly frequent. And it would be, the other thing about fire is it doesn't burn everything. It would burn areas and it would be patchy. But, yeah, definitely if you look at our systems and you look at August and fire strikes, if they hit a grassland area, it's pretty likely a lot of those areas are going to ignite and you would have some level of fire.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Wendy. We have quite a few unanswered questions, but I'm wondering we might be able to copy them and send them to you, and maybe we could get some responses out to our attendees if we can, if you're open for that. Thank you so much for all of your knowledge and your patience and your time. This was a great presentation. I wanted to thank the TNCC who's been here collaborating with us for all your support. And I also want to offer everyone the opportunity to register for the full series. You can register today for 3 more webinars. They're happening the next 3 Wednesdays at noon up until March 15th. And we also have a quick little survey prompt that Ali's just going to put in the chat. If you don't mind opening that, and you can take a couple moments to answer that. Wait, right when you're done here today. And next week, we are going to be joined by Alexis Olenek from the Allen Brooks Nature Center in Vernon, BC. Thank you so much, everyone. So I think we'll have a survey in there from Ali. Thank you. If you don't mind just opening that in a different tab, and you can answer that in your own time. And please sign up for our next webinar presentations we have in the series. We've got 3 more.